Chris Rice, Director of Training and Voter Registration.
Very cool.
America Garcia, Candidate Coordinator.
Cool.
Kylie McNaught, Executive Director.
Nice to meet you.
Hi, Jordan.
Very cool. I love it.
I like that too.
Erin, I teach fourth grade. That's probably not interesting.
Very
interesting.
former teacher.
I'm a past teacher.
Vital.
Me too.
Really smart. Maybe a good idea.
And look, she looks so
She looks so good. She does. She looks
She's got great color.
We love teachers. We love the teachers who organize. So if you're,
I got dress coded in your today.
really? That's awesome. I love that. You're like, but I want to unfuck the grid. Like, what do you?
It was the Luke Warford one. It was the nice one that wore it to work.
Yeah.
And somebody got pissed and they were like, your teachers are not supposed to be advocating for whatever. And so I got it.
You're like, but he's a young candidate, so
I'm
it's
like,
fine.
I was like, my kids can't vote, so it doesn't matter.
It's just-
I'm not influencing
Good
anyone
life.
they can't vote.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming.
Brothers out.
Yeah, I love it. Hey everyone, that's great, super helpful. I'm Luke Warford. I'm the Democratic nominee for Texas Railroad Commission, which obviously has nothing to do with railroads. It actually regulates the Texas oil and gas industry. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the race. We'd love to take a couple questions, take some photos. If Moshi comes over and hangs out, I won't be mad about that. Just to sort of set the table stakes, I think this is one of the most important elected offices in the state, right? It's misnamed, so not that many people know about it, but regulates the oil and gas industry, which is absolutely enormous, essential. Obviously here in Houston in particular, just like the energy capital of the world, means keep the lights on. And something that a lot of folks don't realize about the Railroad Commission is that it was actually at the center of that. We knew that our gas infrastructure, our gas producers, which were, one of the biggest causes of the grid failure, we knew they weren't prepared to operate in cold weather. And basically, in every other state, natural gas production doesn't crash when the weather gets cold, right? Anything about Nebraska, anything about North Dakota. But here, they weren't prepared. And we knew that in 2011, and after the storm, there were all these recommendations to the Texas Railroad Commission being like, hey, you need to make the weather resistant. And over and over again, and the railroad commissioners just didn't do anything about it. And then the storm last year happened. The grid failed, predictably, and the current railroad commissioners have spent the 14 months since then blaming renewables, passing the cost of the storm onto Texans that we're going to be paying off for decades, and lights stay on next time it gets cold. And I remember coming out of the winter storm and sort of like, I know like a lot of people were being like, what the heck happened? Like how is it that in the energy capital of the world in 2021, we literally couldn't keep the lights on and people froze to death? And the reality is I started to peel back the layers and was like, oh, the Railroad Commission could have prevented this. Like there's these 3 corrupt officials that aren't doing their jobs and could have stopped this catastrophe from happening. And I just got mad and decided to run for this office. Just as a little bit of background, I have an economics degree, worked mostly in the private sector, in energy consulting and in tech, but have also worked on Democratic political campaigns. I got my start as an organizer for Obama in 2012 in Cincinnati. And most recently, I worked at the Texas Democratic Party where I ran voter registration in the 2020 cycle. I love that you're doing that. There's so many people. And was most recently the chief strategy officer. And I decided to stop doing that work to go run for this office because I just feel like it's so urgent and so significant and literally a matter of life and death. Beyond the Railroad Commission's role in the grid failure, it has huge impacts on the lives of Texans across our state in all these different ways. So we'll talk about this case where the Railroad Commission is like poisoning local groundwater because they're not taking the necessary safety precautions. We can talk about Texas is the largest greenhouse gas emitter in the country. A huge amount of those emissions come out of the Texas oil and gas industry, and not all of it's necessary, right? It's because the Railroad Commission is not enforcing the existing rules. And I just think issue after issue after issue, when you look, what you see is you see Wayne Christian, who's my opponent, who takes 70% of his campaign contributions from the oil and gas industry, putting the interests of his campaign donors ahead of the interests of Texans. And I think the storm last February just highlighted how we can't take it any longer and we need to do something about it. And so that's why I decided to run. I'm just like incredibly excited to be here in Harris County. I think thank you to the folks who came out to hear me. Thank you to you all for doing this work day in and day out. Like working at a county party, a state party, working on campaigns is hard friggin' work. And truly, like, I know all the numbers bear this out, but really, I cannot win. The other people running statewide this year cannot win without the work you all are going to do in Harris County. And we're here this week, but we'll be back. We've been here a bunch of times, we'll be back over and over and over again. We'd love to take a couple questions.
Yeah.
Like, I truly try to, as a former operative, I love you guys and the work you do, and so I truly try to stop by through here every time I come through Houston, because it matters, and it matters to show up to say thank you, and oh my god. Just so distracting and cute. But yeah, it's just it really matters, and it's hard work, right? I don't need to tell you this, but it just deserves acknowledgement. So I don't know. I'm pretty good.
Well, thank you.
Any questions? Comments?
Yes, I do have a question.
Thanks.
Why do you, what caused the gas the gas shortage?
Yeah.
Was it the oil companies? Was it the regulations? I mean, what cut the gas?
Yeah. That's a great question. So, in a lot of states, there's a standard, everyone talks about weatherization, right? And so in a lot of states, there's a standard that says, if you're going to be a gas producer and be critical to the system, you need to be prepared for temperatures of X down to X degrees. In most states, that's 0 or -10 or whatever. Here, we just didn't have a standard, right? And there's probably 30 things we could do to secure our grid and make sure the lights stay on, but literally just establishing a rule, clearly communicating to gas producers, hey, this is what's expected in terms of heat tracing, and some of this stuff, weatherization seems abstract a lot of the times, but literally some of this stuff is wrapping a wire around the pipe so the pipe doesn't freeze, right? Some of it's not that expensive, especially on new pipelines, new exploration. And so what we need the Railroad Commission to set a standard and then enforce it. And they're starting to talk about a weatherization rule, but they keep punting it, right? It's already been 14 months. And frankly, even if they do pass agree on a standard, which they could have done back in 2011, they've had the statutory authority to be able to do this for a long time. I don't have any faith that they're going to enforce the rule, right? If they make one, because they've got this track record, you look at flaring, they just grant thousands of exemptions every single year, and so I don't have a super high degree of confidence that that standard is going to lead to the outcomes that we want to achieve.
And how do you overcome that? How do you get your branch offices and your to cooperate with you?
I mean, I think it's a few things, right? The Railroad Commission, just for folks who don't know, is an 800-person agency with a lot of people in Austin, but a lot of people based around the state. I think there's some things that are leadership challenges, right? So being a commissioner, you can hold staff accountable and direct them to actually try to chase things down. Hey, right. And so I think that's one thing. I think another thing is that like they have the ability to advocate for more resources from the Texas legislature. So like if the 800 staff aren't enough to do what they need to do in terms of monitoring and enforcement, and if we like look at that and that's a gap, they should be going and advocating for more resources because they're just not. I mean, I think it's probably a combination of a lot of things, like historic complacency and lack of leadership and lack of funding, lack of resources, but it like clearly isn't working. And so I think like again, this all comes back to how do we get them to enforce the rules in the interest of Texans and like be public servants, right? Like
Exactly. Well,
Chris, you want to go ahead?
Yeah.
Also, hey, you want to introduce yourself?
Oh, hey, my name is Cortez, everyone. I'm a precinct shooter here in Montrose, and I was writing a book on regulatory capture of the Texas energy grid. I work in renewable energy, and I just wanted to come see Luke in person, and I really support him.
Did you say writing or reading?
Right?
Wow.
That's what I thought you said.
There's a really good book, there's a really good book written by one of my professors and a mentor of mine. She wrote a book on how it's hard to build renewable energy in this country, and why is that, right? So I work in renewable energy, and the issue we're having is Abbott's cronies are installed in every which place of the state government, and we fundamentally can't get anything done. So.
I've read, what's her name?
Leah Stokes.
Yeah, I've read the...
Short circuiting policy.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to derail this.
It's,
He has to follow the question.
it's on my
I
motion.
like
It's like a PhD thesis. It's,
yeah, that's right.
It's a light read.
It's
It's for boring people like me. Why is that the word?
Thank you for coming. I didn't see yourself. Go ahead, guys.
Yeah, so I think research shows that climate change is disproportionately affecting communities of color and
Yeah.
low-income people.
Yeah.
And I think that we saw that with the freeze.
Yeah.
So my question is, how are you going to prioritize those communities when you're thinking about new regulations that are going to tackle climate change?
Yeah, 100%. And there's like, it's such a good question, and there's so many different directions to take it in. I mean, so last time we were here, we were in Kashmir Gardens talking to some folks who had experienced like disaster after disaster after disaster, right? It was like most recently there had been all of this damage from Hurricane Harvey, and then they were finally digging themselves out to like try to fix their roof and some holes in the floor, and then the freeze happened, and their pipes burst, and there's like all this damage, and it had been more than a year, they're still dealing with that, right? I think that's a really common experience, in particular among communities of color and low-income communities. And so when I think about like how the Railroad Commission does its work, there's all of these, again, like it is a regulatory agency where the commissioners have all of this discretion about how to implement the rules, right? So there's, when a new, like if somebody wanted to drill a new well, the Railroad Commission does an evaluation of like the impact on the local community, the impact on the environment, the impact on the local groundwater. But what you see is that they like just discount those impacts, right? Like they're like, oh yeah, well our staff said it might be bad for the local community, but like who gives a shit? Like we're gonna approve it anyway. And so I think like simply having somebody who's gonna take those things seriously, right? Like and actually value, that's like an abstract answer, but like I will value the impact on communities, in particular communities of color, I'll value the impact on the environment in a totally different way than the current commissioners, who like pay that stuff lip service and then just do what's best for their campaign donors, like over and over and over again. And then I think the other thing I would say is like, this is a huge opportunity, especially with the lack of federal action on climate. This race is a huge opportunity, and I actually think it's in the interest of the oil and gas industry to lower their emissions too, and we can talk more about that. But this is a huge opportunity to make an impact on like U.S. emissions in general, which then obviously helps slow climate change and then mitigates the impact. But that's like sort of a bigger, less immediate, more, but like still also a really significant impact, right? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Go ahead, Katie.
So we know.
Katie's gonna lob me a question right now. I don't know what it is, so but I'm or maybe she can ask me a hard one.
Is we know that our opponents in the Republican Party are crooked and twisted. But I think Wayne Christian, for those who don't know him, right, it's on a whole new level.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about your opponent and what we're up against?
Yeah. So, and I'll talk about him a little bit more in detail afterwards. But I think there's this like one example of how corrupt he is that really like paints the picture most effectively. And it's like a cartoonish level of corruption, right? Like people think, oh, elected, politicians are corrupt. It's like, no, this is like absurd. So a few months ago, this case came out where a company had applied for a permit for an oil and gas waste disposal site just north of Midland, right? And it's standard procedure for the Railroad Commission, as we were talking about, to evaluate the impact on the environment, the impact on the local community, the impact on groundwater. And they looked at this project and they looked at the impact on local groundwater and they were like, no, we should not approve this. This is on top of the Ogallala Aquifer, which literally provides groundwater for 20 million people all the way up to South Dakota. And they were like, no, this site too close to the aquifer, shouldn't approve it. Meanwhile, Wayne Christian looks at that recommendation from his staff and says, no, we're going to approve it. We're going to approve this anyway. We're going to go forward with this. This is totally fine. 3 days later, the company that had applied for the permit, which number one is based in his hometown, 500 miles away from the site, gives him a literally $100,000 campaign contribution. 3 days later, if that's not enough, they are literally called the High Roller Group. Like, you can't make this up. So like the High Roller Group gave him $100,000 3 days after making a decision against the recommendation of his staff to poison the groundwater. And it's like, they have just operated with impunity for so long and without accountability, and it's been so long since a Democrat has held that office that they're not even trying to hide it anymore. And so I think it's like,
It's true.
right, they're not, but we see this over and over again, and the thing that's interesting about Wayne Christian, my opponent, is I really think he's like one of the weakest Republican candidates, like by far. And obviously I know everyone says that, but he is unpopular in the oil and gas industry. So there's some executives who like him, but mostly he's pretty unpopular in the industry. He had 4 primary challengers, all from the industry, who are all like, this guy's corrupt, he's allowing black marks on the reputation of the oil and gas industry, he's allowing bad actors to pollute and make a bad name for everybody. He literally spent $660,000 and didn't even clear 50% in the primary. So he's in a runoff that he'll win, but is not popular among the oil and gas industry, is not particularly popular among the Republican Party. Like the 3 commissioners all kind of bicker and hate each other. And so I think like when we look at opportunities to win statewide this year, the Railroad Commission, because of how weak Wayne Christian is and because of how salient the power outage was to Texans across the state, I think it's like one of the most winnable races in the state.
Thanks for coming. Yeah.
Thank you for coming.
I'm gonna ask you a tough question. Sorry, this is on Pierce where you stand on.
Yeah.
What do we do about flaring in the Permian Basin? Is there a way to better regulate it? And what do we do about controlling methane emissions out there?
Yeah, 100. So, that's not a hard question. Come on.
Well, I want to keep it light. Because I'm gonna vote for it. You know?
So, as context for everybody, flaring is one of the biggest sources of methane and greenhouse gases. There's a rule in Texas that says companies aren't supposed to flare for more than 10 days, but what you actually see is that the Railroad Commission grants literally thousands of flaring exemptions every single year. So I think and I think that's true with flaring. We can talk about orphan wells as well, which is another huge source of methane. But I think honestly, step one is just enforcing the existing regulations that exist on the books, right? Like we shouldn't be granting thousands of exemptions and extensions every year for flaring, because that is a huge source of, like, if the rule says 10 days, but then you grant almost every exemption, that's not really the rule, right? The rule is they end up flaring for 6 months or a year or longer. I think similarly, like, we should be taking more action on capping orphan wells. There's all this federal money right now with the Biden administration to help with the orphan well situation. The Railroad Commission just, like, doesn't want to work with the federal government because of their egos or because of, you know, what politics. Right, because of politics. And we could just be addressing this situation really concretely. But the thing that I would say that's really interesting about your point, right, is that, and I think, and I'm inferring, but I think the reason you said it is a hard question is because, like, oh, maybe that'll be unpopular with some
That's right, that's right. Yeah.
But I have stood in front of, and I think the situation in Ukraine right now totally changes, like, it has created space where Texas gas producers, basically like European gas buyers, are going to be looking to buy natural gas from places outside of Russia, right? They've been dependent on Russian gas for a long time, and they're going to be looking elsewhere. And Texas is one place they're going to look. But European buyers care about not only the price of the gas, but the emissions of the gas. And Texas gas has a bad reputation. And it's got a bad reputation because, I think most people in the industry think, because the Railroad Commission is not enforcing that there's certain bad actors who are spoiling the reputation of the whole bunch, and the Railroad Commission is not holding them accountable. And so I literally stood in front of a room of 100 oil and gas executives that, like, obviously are not particularly friendly to a Democrat, and made the case that lower emissions, that because of where we are and where the economy, the, like, global oil and gas market is going, that lower emissions is actually good for their business. And getting their house in order is good for their business, and what they need is they need a regulator who can credibly say, hey, we enforce the existing regulations and we're actually cleaning our act up. Because if the Railroad Commission right now said that, nobody would believe them. Because that's what we're going to need to compete in 5 and 10 and 15 years in global markets, or else we're going to lose out to Saudi Arabia and other places where there's better gas. What do you think about that?
I agree. I mean, you know, you're here, you're our candidate, right? Right. I think we should take it even a step further.
Yeah.
And I like what California is doing, more stringent methane. So methane, when it sits in the atmosphere, it actually traps more heat than carbon dioxide does.
Yeah.
Right. So
Like 25 times.
Yeah, that's
Like
right.
a huge, huge
That's right.
effect.
It's a huge problem. That's why California is taking a real strong stance on it, and I really would like to see Texas go that route.
Yeah.
We're really built on an oil and gas economy. I know it might not be feasible for some folks, but I'm also biased because I build grid-scale solar for a living, so I think we don't even need natural gas in the long term.
Yeah.
Right? I think we just start building an electrified grid right now that's powered renewable energy. So I mean, I just want to see what you said. I'm sorry to over
Yeah. Well, and to the point, like, Texas is a state with an incredibly empowered legislature, right? And so that's, like, not even, regardless of where you stand on that, like, we would need the legislature to
Yeah, that's Mr. Representative Warford.
yeah, Gene. I'll talk to you about it later.
What?
We were talking about things we need the legislature to do.
Yeah, yeah. We're having a good time trying to get his colleagues who are backed by oil or fossil fuel money to pass something that's going to hurt them, right?
Yeah, 100%. And I think, that's one of the reasons, though, why I think this office is interesting, right? Is because we don't need to flip the entire ledge. Like, the Railroad Commission, already within the existing legal framework, the existing laws, there's opportunities for improvement, right? And obviously, it's, like, not enough, but I do think there's, like, real impact.
I was like 10 minutes late, so I'm gonna ask you, what's compelling you to run? What, you know, did you wake up one morning and go, wow, I have to run for Texas Railroad?
Well, yeah, so I mean, I think, like, and I talked about this a little bit at the beginning, but I think it's a couple things, right? One is, I genuinely think this is one of the most important elected offices in the state. And I thought the book you were going to reference was like David Prindle's book on the history of the Railroad Commission from 1891 to 1980, because, like, I have it, and it's
classic.
Right, the classic David Prindle. But the thing, like, I've been a nerd about this office for a long time. because of how important it is. But the thing that set me over the edge was the grid failure last February, right? Like being cold and without power, the uncertainty around when the lights were going to come back on, the fact that like this sort of unconscionable crisis that was preventable happened in the energy capital of the world, and to like learn that the Railroad Commission really could have easily taken steps to prevent it, that this was all, you know, avoidable. And it's not that much more complex than I got angry, right? And was like, I'm gonna go try to beat this guy, because he's terrible,
They're corrupt cronies.
Yeah. Hello.
I want you to win.
Thank you.
I want our state to improve. So what is our state party doing? I've been back in Texas since 2016. I haven't heard a peep
Yeah.
from them about what they're doing in terms of coordinating campaign and just, you know, putting the elbow grease
Yeah.
and the components into winning is not, we don't have to reinvent the wheel for crying out loud.
Yeah.
So
And
what is our state party doing?
and
That's a genuinely serious
Yeah.
question.
and do you know that I worked at the state party for 2 years before running? And can you introduce yourself?
My name is Ruth Ann Scaff,
Hi, Ruth Ann.
and I'm a really old gal. And when I was about your age, I found myself accidentally almost on the Democratic National Committee as an at-large member
Cool.
from Texas.
Yeah.
So that was, you know, a few lifetimes ago. I'm back in Texas, and I am just distressed about the polarization in our state and the dysfunctionalism.
Yeah.
And what is our state party doing? And how can we all join forces and leverage, leverage the human resources in our state?
Yeah, 100%. So, and I have a particular opinion on this, obviously, because I used to work. I went to go work at the state party because, like you, I believe in the importance of state parties. I always want them to be better and stronger and better funded. I think, you know, am really proud of a bunch of the work that I was able to do there. I ran a voter registration program where we registered more than 100,000 Texas voters. I raised several $1 million for the party while I was there. I think, you know, there are things, it's moving in the right direction. Like there were improvements that were made. I think similarly, like Texas is a country, right? Like Texas is literally a 30 million person state. Harris County in itself is bigger than, you know, 25 or 27 states, I think.
And some countries.
And so,
They're not Harris County states.
and so like the scale of the work like is just massive compared to the amount of resources that the state party has or that the Harris County Democratic Party has. So I think that's one thing I would say. The other thing I would say is that like we've been working with the state party for months now to try to, we were the first, we didn't have a primary opponent, so we were the first sort of candidate who was looking towards the general election and had been working with the other statewide candidates to try to figure out the details of the coordinated with Better Works campaign with the party. I think a lot of that is going to become more solidified after the runoffs, obviously, because we don't know who the whole slate is.
I'm just saying
Yeah.
that I've been looking and listening for 6 years. I haven't heard a peep of any influence the state party has. I don't want to throw rocks. I'm saying,
Yeah.
you know, it's a tree falling in the forest and no one's hearing it. What do you advise that we do?
Well, I would almost ask you back though. What would you like to see out of the state party, or what are you like? Yeah, what are the types of things that you would like to see them doing that they're not doing? I think there's a lot of work that, like the voter protection program we ran in 2020 was probably the best voter protection program in the country. A woman named Rose Clouston, who's the Texas voter protection director, ran that, worked with county parties across the state, is literally like a national expert on that work. And so, like, I'm just curious.
Perhaps it's communicating this stuff
Yeah.
to to not only the base, but, you know, to the population at large, so that we can complete that circle and people know about it and feel empowered and energized. My friends and I are gonna do what we're gonna do.
Yeah.
We're gonna go out and vote, we're gonna try to get our friends to vote, we're gonna meet deputy voter registrars and all that jazz.
That's
But
awesome.
unless we know that, you know, you feel empowered when you know that, of the progress and the effort in other communities. We're not hearing it.
Yeah.
We're not hearing it.
Yeah. I mean, I think the folks in this office can probably help, and
Well,
with
I'm
communicating
on
with
the
the.
email list for Harris County, and I don't want to monopolize everything. I'm just, you know.
I just mean they work with the state party folks, I'm sure, and I can get you in touch with, and like, there's like better people for you to give that feedback to than me, right? I no longer work there, and so I just mean like those are really valid concerns, and I think that you should communicate them to the people who have the power to change them.
As a Democrat, you mentioned earlier that, you know, you were talking to the 100 oil execs, and you know, you're a Democrat going into the Railroad Commission. We can all understand the implications. How are you gonna hold your own, and, you know, understanding that Texas, there are a lot of Republicans in Texas, while still holding your own as a Democrat
Yeah.
with Ed
Exactly what
in the
I'd like
office?
to
Yeah.
do. You've got a big job.
So, okay, do you mean how am I going to win, or how?
Oh no! Once after you've won, you've already won. You already got there.
Those,
I can just like my best friend, her mom works for the Railroad Commission
Yeah.
in Columbus, and you're not popular. So.
Whoops.
You had a great question.
Oops.
You mean against Railroad Commission staff, or?
Yeah, like they would much rather Wayne Christian win.
Oh, yeah.
Because I was like, telling my friend, we're gonna go do this, and she's like, yeah, my mom was telling me about that. She goes, I don't like you. And I was just like,
People don't like change.
That's why we need them, right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
So, I mean, I think there's a few things, right? Like, it's a three-person commission, right? I do think an individual commissioner has a huge amount of power. So currently what the commission is doing is they pass, basically the way commission business works is a company applies for a permit, the staff evaluate the permit, make a recommendation to the commissioners vote on the application. Currently, like, most things get passed through something called the consent agenda, where there's no witnesses, there's no public debate. And so they have these public meetings every 2 weeks where they're supposed to vote on stuff, and they literally introduce like items 6 through 222 and like approve all of them at once, right? And so as an individual commissioner, you actually have a huge amount of power because I would just dissent, right? And we call people to have hearings, to call witnesses, to really just like slow down the approval process for some of the like flaring exemptions and things that I didn't agree with. You know, this Ogallala Aquifer case, for example. So I think that's one thing. The second thing you would do as an individual commissioner is like in the first 2 years, because it's a 6-year term. I think there's like one of the biggest problems is the lack of transparency, right? People don't know what the agency's doing, they don't know what it does. So I would probably like go on local news and yell a lot about what was happening to try to like increase scrutiny. And then obviously work to get a second like Democratic commissioner elected.
Right on.
And you know, and then in those like last 4 years, you can obviously do a lot more. But it doesn't surprise me. I mean, I spent a lot of time talking about.
well, and according to her, the Corpus office is
Okay,
not us.
my oil and gas is through family lineage.
Yeah.
And my dad stopped drilling and operating in '98.
Yeah.
So we don't have much to do with the Railroad Commission anymore.
Yeah.
It's, we lease, we've got tons of mineral properties and such like that.
Yeah.
Anyway, so when did it become a 3-person commission?
It's always been.
Has it always been? I thought it was, no, I don't believe so.
I'm pretty sure it's always been a 3-person commission.
Is that right?
Yeah.
It's always been. 10th of the street.
Yeah. Rep Woo.
It always has been.
Yeah.
Okay.
It used to not exist.
Yeah, before 1891 it didn't exist.
Yeah.
Do we want to take one or two more questions? And maybe maybe we get the road probably. That's what I'm hearing from my team.
Where are you going?
Boston. Home.
We've got a hard deadline, so I gotta be the bad guy.
Statewide campaign sucks. It's hard.
If anyone has figured out how to clone people yet to be in multiple places at once,
You're really
Castro boys.
that's the next barrier. People are like, well, where were you this morning, or where did you go? And I don't know anymore.
You should just start wearing a mask when you go. That way you can just like MF Doom people and
There
put
you
people
go.
behind the different masks. Yeah.
Well, I hired a finance director who has my name and kind of looks like me,
Boom.
so like we're halfway there.
We're all good.
Yeah.
I would love to get a good photo, guys, if you would be
Yeah.
up for it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Does anyone have like? I'm good. All right. Thank you all. Let's get a photo.